Or Mike?
All set, Craig.
Okay. Carol or Mike, do either of you want to start the meeting? We don't have a chairman.
Hi, Carol.
Let me do it. Okay, I'd like to call the meeting of the
Thank you.
House Needs Study Committee Affordable Housing Plan on Monday, July 13th. The time is, I don't know,
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. Can we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
Under God.
under
liberty.
God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I'll do the roll call. All right, Commissioner Anist,
Here.
Commissioner Woods,
Here.
Commissioner Hall.
Here.
I know you're here. Commissioner Lynch. I know she's here. And Commissioner Camillo.
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum. And the next item is public participation. Is there anyone in the attendee room that wants to speak? All right, James, nobody has their hand raised?
I give them a second usually, but nothing so far.
Yeah, Mark does not want to.
Mark.
Yeah.
Oh, all right, let's move on to item number 4, review / discussion of the briefing booklets. And I will turn it over to Mr. Chalder.
Thank you very much, Craig. I've got 2 briefing booklets I've prepared to help, I guess, promote some discussion for us. The first briefing booklet is really just a repeat of the kickoff meeting materials that we talked about at our first meeting. But I realized after that meeting that we're probably going to want to post this on the town website, and the booklet, the memo itself wasn't really as configured as well as I wanted it to, and I wanted to create a series of documents. So this is really just the briefing, the kickoff materials reformatted as a briefing booklet. And I think this will allow people who may figure out in a days, weeks, or months what we're working on. This would give them some basic material, what it's all about. So any questions on this one, or makes sense to post that and move ahead?
I'm fine with that.
Good. So booklet number 2 is really baseline information to talk about the affordable housing plan. I think the first issue here in the booklet is to provide a definition for people who aren't familiar with housing and housing affordability, what affordable housing is all about. The basic phrase affordable housing can have a generic meaning, and housing that is more affordable. But I also think that in terms of public policy, which is really what we're working on, it refers to housing which is priced so that people and families earning 80% or less of the area median income pay 30% or less of their annual income on housing. So I've put together information that looks at that information for Newington and for the Hartford area. I think it's important to note, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that when we use the definitions, the income levels, we find that there's a lot of housing in Newington which is already affordable. It either sells or rents at prices that make it affordable to people earning the median income and less. And so we call that naturally occurring affordable housing. But the other definition, the definition the state essentially uses, is housing which is encumbered in some way to sell or rent at those affordable prices. So even though a house may, or a condominium or apartment may be naturally affordable, it doesn't count to the state's master list in terms of the 10% threshold. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we're going to talk about both types of housing as part of the discussion overall. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to jump in. Pages 2, 3, 4, and 5 is really just an overview about why communities want or need affordable housing. Everybody wants housing that's more affordable. People who are buying or renting houses want it to cost less, and people who are selling housing want it to cost more. And that's really what the market's all about. So this talks about some of the people who may want or need housing, which is affordable, and particularly meets the definition we talked about earlier. It could be young people just out of college, trying to find their way in the world and looking for housing. I think at one of our POCD meetings, we had a gentleman whose son was out of college and moved back in with them, and he was hoping for an opportunity to get him out of the house. But there's other people like that too. Young families, I think we've learned in the COVID times that we have critical workers who provide critical services, and having them afford to live in Newington would be something we could aspire to as well, and seniors and longtime residents overall. And I think on page 3, there's a whole bunch of questions here that if anybody reading this report was to go through this and say, does Newington have housing for people in these different categories, they might understand better what our work effort is all about and what we're hoping to do in terms of providing for housing for people. On page 4, I think it's important to point out that housing is not something that we can just add water to and have it pop up. Housing takes time to produce. In fact, if somebody had an elderly parent or family member who needed housing today, sometimes if it's involved the housing authority, that housing is not going to be available for 2 years. You got to get on a waiting list and hope that the housing is there when you want it. And this can be a challenge for people because those needs oftentimes are today. So having housing to meet housing needs is something that we can and should, I think, aspire to. And so that's an important point to get across. And finally, on page 5, housing supports the economic development of the community. All the jobs that we have in Newington and people that are here, our economy in Newington thrives because we also have housing choices, and having additional housing choices wouldn't be a bad thing. So that kind of lays out the concept of housing and why housing is important. And then on page 6, we start to get into how much affordable housing we actually have in Newington today. So I start off with the state definition of affordable housing units. And the state credits Newington with having 1,155 units which meet the state guidelines and criteria because they're either governmentally assisted, tenant rental assistance. Now that's money that goes to people, not to units. Governmentally assisted goes to units, not to people. CHFA and U.S. Department of Agriculture mortgages, and again, those go to qualifying low and moderate income people. And then we have deed restricted units. As a result, our share is 8.9%, and that puts us close to the state's 10% threshold in terms of affordable housing. And then the different housing developments are listed below here in terms of which units are elderly only. There's some for the Housing Authority and some other developments which have received state or federal funding assistance. There's family and elderly. And there's also a group home. So that's the inventory of the 1,155 units that we have.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay, for group homes, how are those determined? Because I know there's like condos that are being rented out by either the state or by nonprofits that get assistance.
So this is the only one in the state inventory list. So if there are others, we can ask the state why they're not on this list. This one, I believe, is the Connecticut Institute for the Blind.
Okay.
So that's.
Steve, do you know if there's one on Maple Hill?
There was one. The state, it's still occupying, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, right near Maple Hill in Robbins, as you turn. If you turn left onto Maple.
Next door to the Emmanuel Christian Academy.
Yeah.
There's 2.
There's a group home there too. And I know there's some condos at Foxborough as well.
Craig, do you have a list of these?
And you have Mountain Road too.
No,
Oh, yeah.
the one on Cedar Street.
So Craig,
Where is the one?
It's right across from Town Hall. It's on the north
Oh,
side.
yeah, right next to, yeah. Yeah, because I believe there is more. I think Mike and Steve can agree.
Craig, can you do me a favor, put together a short list of group homes, and I'll inquire of the state as to whether or not, why are those not on the list? And it may be a funding issue, or there may not be long-term restrictions, but I think it's important. I'd like to know the answer, and I'm sure you would as well. So if Craig can
Thank
get me that information, I'm on it.
Hey, Glenn,
Yes.
the other question I have is, on this list that we have, the Griswold Hills, Victory Gardens, Southfield Apartments, I could speak to Southfield. I know we have 100% occupancy. Do we have 100% occupancy in Griswold and Victory Gardens? Do we know? I'm assuming yes.
I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, so again, for me, which speaks to the need, while we have it, but if what we have is full, we need to get some more, at least till we get to that 10%.
I think that's part of the reason.
And
Go ahead,
Victory
Carol.
Victory Gardens, they're expanding there too, aren't they? Putting another 30 units there?
Another
Yeah,
thing.
they're going to take the nursing village there and turn that into housing.
Right. Craig, has that come forward yet?
No, they've had preliminary meetings with the previous town manager. I don't think they've reconnected with us since Mr. Chapman has arrived.
All right, Craig, I'm just going to make a note of that. You and I may circle back. It may make sense for us to touch base with them in the not too distant future. I think it's important now to talk a little bit about the data on the top of page 7. The information here, tenant rental assistance again goes to people, and the CHFA mortgages goes to people as well. Those numbers fluctuate. So tenant rental assistance, we have 116 today, but in the past, that number has been somewhere between 84, in the past 10 years, between 84 and 148 units. So if there's going to be 30 something units at Victory Gardens, and we can get the tenant rental assistance total back up, we can certainly get a lot closer to meeting the state threshold. Same thing, we're at the peak right now in terms of CHFA mortgages, but I think it's important to note this is a place where Newington benefits from having a naturally occurring affordable housing stock, because people can take the qualifying mortgage, buy a house in Newington that meets or exceeds their needs, and become long-term residents, and we can get credit for those mortgages while they're in place. Finally, there's 36 deed restricted units at the present time, and they're all restricted in perpetuity. So some towns are struggling with the fact that deed restricted units expire. And the state database says that these are in perpetuity, and again, that's going to benefit in the long run. And then finally, at the bottom of the page is a comparison of Newington relative to all 169 municipalities in Connecticut, where we stand, and then a focus in on units which are, communities which either have a similar number of housing units to us, about the same population size, if you will, but also a similar affordability percentage, so that we can see where we're at with some other sort of peer communities here overall. The next page is where we get into the math, and I'm going to kind of summarize the math, but the math is here for people who want to follow them through. Affordability programs are based on the income relative to the family size or the household size. And so what we track is one person households all the way on up, and they report the relative incomes for the Hartford region. And these are the numbers which are reported by the state. I've checked Newington specific numbers. Our one person median income is lower than this, quite a bit lower than this. But our 2-person, 3-person, et cetera, are all higher than the median that is reported for the state. But these are the numbers that would come back from a state report in terms of meeting the affordable housing needs or issues. When we go through the math calculation of 80% of median income, 30% to housing, we get a housing allotment, and then we're able to translate that in the middle of the page to the gross rent that somebody would pay. And then as we get down to the very bottom of the page, we can talk also now about what sale price that would support. I think it's important to note we're at historic lows in interest rates. So as a result, the income that goes to principal and interest is going to buy as much house today as maybe it could be in my lifetime. So we compare fairly well in terms of these income levels. If we go on to page 9, we have information from the census, which tells us what units in Newington are renting for. So according to the census data, there was over 2,500 rental units in Newington. Now, these can be apartments, they can be condominiums, they can be single-family homes that somebody's renting out, but there's 2,600 rental units in town, and the median rent is $1,235. So that means half the units rent for less than that, half for more, and you can see the rough distribution here. But according to our information from the income levels, a one-person household could afford $1,370 a month, a two-person household $1,570. So you can see that we have a naturally occurring affordable housing stock that people who earn 80% of the median income can afford those homes. And in fact, at the very bottom of the page, in terms of rent, if we compare the income numbers to those gross monthly rents, we have somewhere between 1,700 and 2,600 units, which are naturally affordable rental units in Newington. So it's something, again, for us to be aware of and acknowledge. It doesn't necessarily help us with the state percentage, but it is an important number. On the next page, on page 10, we go through the math and we calculate it out in terms of the census information about how owners value their house. Now, these are not sale prices, but people who live in owner housing generally have a pretty good sense of what they think their house is worth, and this is what they reported to the Census Bureau. The median house value that they report is $232,700, and you can see from the bottom of this page that in terms of the housing that people can afford, we have somewhere between 1,200 and 3,000 ownership units in Newington that are naturally affordable. So again, that's somewhere between 10 and 25% of the 2010 housing stock in town. So we have a naturally affordable housing stock. If we go to page 11, I also worked with the assessor to get the town's assessor's database. And so this chart shows you the number of housing units at different prices. And given the affordable levels, you can see here, again, based on the assessor's data, that we have a number of naturally occurring affordable housing units, and the numbers supplement and support what the census information shows. So this is a transition point now in the information I put together. So if we have all these units of naturally occurring affordable housing, you might say, well, then, do we need more? And I think starting on page 12 is where we start to get into this particular issue or situation. Even though we have a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing, there are still many situations in Newington where there's not enough housing. And so we have long waiting lists for elderly units, approximately 2 years. And our elderly population is expected to continue to grow. It's possible. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID. Life expectancies are longer. People may not have the resources that they will need in the future to meet their housing needs. It is often the largest or most expensive expense for people. And I think we'll find out a little bit later in terms of the data that it's the elderly that are most impacted by housing costs and housing cost increases. In addition, the header here says no family units, and that's not true. I wrote that thinking in my mind about the housing authority. They have no housing units. They have long waiting lists for vouchers. They tell me that it could be the list is closed, and if they were to open it, they get inundated. I think they had over 3,000 applications one year when they did open it. But even if you were on their list, it could be 8 to 10 years before your name comes up. So it's a challenging situation to address that. We do have, I think as Steve pointed out earlier, we have private non-housing authority developments which do address and provide units for family. But again, I think there's a significant need, as we'll find out in a moment, in terms of the census data. Newington's also a little unique because we have some at-risk populations. Homelessness is not a big issue in town, but it does occur on occasion. And some of the motels along the Berlin Turnpike do have a residency issue. On page 13, we have some historic information issues of overcrowding and physical deficiencies dates from censuses in the 60s and 70s. But there are some units which are identified as having either incomplete plumbing or incomplete kitchen facilities. And again, that might be a situation where they don't actually have a full stove. They might have a cooktop or something else like that. So these issues are not as significant as they were 30, 40, 50 years ago, but it is an issue or consideration. And the same thing in terms of occupants per room. Occupants per room can be an indication where extended families are living together, or because they can't afford housing, they're affording what they can and then putting the size of their family into it. So these are issues to be aware of. And then the census reports information about cost burden, they call it. Now, if a household is spending more than 30% of their income on housing, they're considered to be cost burdened. And I think where this is important is to think about who could be cost burdened. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So when we look at renters, about 42% of the renter population pays more than 30% of their income on housing. I think we go to the next page, about 28% of the owners in town with a mortgage pay more than 30% of their income on housing, and about 19% of homeowners with no mortgage are still housing cost burden. Now, this can be a situation where somebody buys a house and stretches beyond their budget. So if somebody's earning more than the median income or way more than the median income, if they want to spend 30% or more of their income on housing, they generally have the means to do it, and they might give up a vacation. On the other hand, when you deal with a family that's earning 80% or less of the area median income, they don't have that much extra in their budget to be able to address the kinds of situations without perhaps giving up healthcare, transportation, food, some of the other needs or issues that may come along. So overall, there's almost 3,500 households in Newington spending more than 30% of their income on housing. But I think what's more important is what's now on the next page, page 15. What we see here is that renters are the most income constrained. So this is a chicken and egg thing. They're probably living in rental housing because they're income constrained. And as you can see here, I think from this information, the blue shaded box on the middle of page 15 shows that the highest percentages of low income exist for people who are 65 years and up. So these are people living on limited incomes. They may not have the assets that people who have lived in rental housing may have, but they're the ones that could be the most challenged in terms of housing needs as they get older. And the same thing happens again with homeowners as well. Homeowners might have a little bit of a buffer. They've got some equity in their house. That mortgage may be paid off, but still in terms of cash income, their housing costs are becoming a greater and greater burden for them. And that carries over also onto page 16, where we start talking about cost burden to owners. There's no perfect data here, but if we start thinking about different income groups, the people who are earning less than $60,000 a year are most likely to be spending more than 35% of their income on housing. And it makes sense. If you don't have the income, the housing costs what it does, you're likely to be cost burdened. And the same thing at the bottom of the page is when we look at it by age, households age 65 and older, are more likely to be spending 35% of their income on housing as well. So these are yes.
Glenn, does that get somewhat skewed though? Because you take somebody who's, let's say, did very well for themselves, but their only income is Social Security, but they've got $3 million in the bank, save for retirement, right? That's not accounted for in any of this, correct?
Assets are not counted perfectly in the data. I've been trying to figure out this situation. The United Way has a data set that they call ALICE. Have you heard of ALICE?
I have, yeah.
So for those who may not, ALICE is asset limited, income constrained, and employed.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you very much, Jim. So this information here shows what the actual cost of living is for people. And what percentage of Newington's population falls into that category. And I think the number, it's on the far right here, I think it's 32% is where Newington is at. So I've been through the metadata that goes with this, Steve. The asset limited isn't really measured in the ALICE data, it's assumed. So it's not a perfect data source either. So the issue ends up being, it's not, the need is not perfectly defined. And I think I talk about this a little bit later, is that it's hard to get to specificity. Each person, each household is a little bit different. So what we can do is take it as an indication of the people who are likely to be, more likely to be stressed, and start to evaluate those needs as we move ahead.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that all seniors have, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in the bank, but it is something that really isn't accounted for here.
Correct. I agree.
Yep.
And I don't know how you could account for it because, you know, it's obviously something very private and no one's going to share that information.
Yep. Understood. And I think,
but I think it skews that group. I think that group wouldn't be as high if there was some way to measure that.
I'll keep working on that, Steve, because I think that the very points that you bring up, other people are going to bring up as well and say, well, you know, the need isn't as great as you have estimated. And I think it could be true that if you look at the census data and so on, you say to yourself, my gosh, 3,500 households are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. But again, it may be ignoring assets, passive income, and other things like that. I think the thing that I think is most striking to me is, again, the waiting period of 2 years or longer. Carol, go ahead.
So there's definitely a need. I'm not disputing that, but
Yep.
I just think it skews that age group.
And can you just, I think for clarification for anybody watching or whatever, just to explain, I mean, what exactly is included in a housing cost?
Thank you. So if it breaks it into two groups, mortgage and non-mortgage. So if you have a mortgage, you're in group one, and if you don't have a mortgage, you're in group two. Then in addition to that, it's real estate taxes, utilities, insurance. Trying to think if I'm missing anything big. I think the math here, let me see just for a second.
You had a condo, would the HOA fees be included?
Yes, it would. So
I don't think there's anything else.
yeah, so if you go back, if you would, just for a moment to page 8. So these are the main categories. It's utility allowances, which again is broken down here on the very bottom table on the bottom of page 8. Utilities, and then insurance and taxes. So that includes homeowners insurance, et cetera, and then principal and interest. So condo fees would also be in the et cetera part.
Okay. So if you had no mortgage, if you're anybody who had no mortgage,
Yep.
and I mean, I think our mill rate has an effect on these numbers as well. But if you had no mortgage and you're just paying your taxes, your utilities, and your homeowner, somebody making $24,000 could theoretically fits into the category. They'd be below 30% of their income.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question gets back to kind of what Steve was talking about in terms of their assets that are available. The town tax rate is about 2.5% of the market value of property. So if somebody had a $200,000 house, that's about $5,000 a year in taxes. $300,000 is $7,500. So that's probably the most significant expense overall. When you start thinking about even utilities and everything else, it depends on the size of the house and so on. So there's no perfect data source there either, Carol.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I think that's the cost burdened owners and renters are on page 16 and 17 of the booklet overall. And again, the people most cost burdened, as you might anticipate, are lower income households and older households who are most likely to be living on limited income. Pages 18 and 19 of the booklet are just a quick review of the plan of conservation and development, some of the basic strategies which are in here. Much of the things which this data reports are information which was summarized in the POCD. On page 19, we actually talk about specific strategies, some of which we've touched upon in terms of trying to diversify the housing portfolio in town, encourage the maintenance and improvement for people who choose to age in place in their current housing, And I think that's important because I think those people don't need necessarily public assistance. They can survive with some assistance in their current homes, et cetera. And then starting on page 20 is some possible strategies for Newington to think about and talk about as part of this affordable housing plan. And I think my goal is to kind of promote discussion with you guys in terms of some of these different strategies and other ones that could start to address our housing needs and to identify, action steps going forward that may make sense for us. So I'll go through these one by one, and my goal is to kind of get a Three Bears temperature feedback from you guys, as that's probably doable, not doable, comfortable, not comfortable, et cetera. So the first one is produce more elderly units. So we're about 147 units away from the 10% threshold. We've got a 2-year waiting period. They generally go, units free up. But adding 150 units of elderly housing over the next 5 years would start to address the need for elderly housing units. Is this a strategy which you think could get traction in Newington, something we're ready to tackle? Carol?
I agree. I think that's where we're really lacking. But not only, as I'm looking at what we have right now with the Housing Authority overseas, I've talked to a lot of individuals who are looking for, and I call it transitional housing. And Craig, I was on TPZ and I brought this up too. I feel when a person goes from their, 3 or 4 bedroom home, they don't want to go into an efficiency, or they are not ready for assisted living. We need some sort of transitional rental property. People don't want to have to worry about paying an HOA fee, taking care of any problems that are in the interior of their units. But something like, a bedroom on the first floor, maybe with a loft so a family could visit, or, an office. They're looking for something a little bit bigger than what our housing overseas, but yet not a house or a condo.
Market rate, then, Carol?
Market rate.
So we've got several thousand housing units in Newington that could meet that definition. Are they?
Not a house, a rental. So the master bedrooms on the first floor. I mean, I can't think, there is a project in Berlin off of Webster Street. It's on the Berlin side. Something like that is what people are asking for. And like I said, I call it transitional. It's not the house or the condo, but it's not assisted living or an efficiency small 1-bedroom unit.
Okay. When I summarize that for the minutes here, is that you said we need transitional housing for what I'm calling the recent empty nester who isn't ready for elderly housing. It's something.
Correct. But doesn't want to be responsible for taxes for, for taking care of the interior, if their faucet leaks or whatever. I mean, and I know people who have moved into apartments in Weathersfield because they get the size that they need, and there's nothing in Newington that kind of fits that. They sold their 3,000 square foot home, but they're not ready for assisted living. They're not ready to ride in an elevator and that type of thing.
So this is, I think, a good situation. There could be 2 housing needs in this category, one of which is for the elderly on limited income who may need a housing authority unit. And I think we have a 2-year wait list and a shortage there, but also market rate units and affordable options for people who are empty nester or even retired, but they want to spend time in different areas or whatever to address that need, but to update them for the needs of today. So that could include elevator, it could include 1-floor living, universal access.
I mean, and they have a gym, like a fitness area, a community room where if they want to, host a family party, they can rent it out. Like things like, like that.
Yep.
I think we don't have anything in this town. And I know people have lived in this town who have moved out of the town because we don't provide or don't have anything that meets that.
So the challenge we have is we don't have a lot of land available for that. So the way that we could encourage the private market to do something like that would be to allow for density. Because what density does, it allows somebody to look at the math in terms of assembling or acquiring property and getting an economic
The
return.
train station, that's like, I'm thinking like something like this there. I
Yep.
mean, I think that's a gold mine that we can really utilize
Yep.
to promote more of this housing at the market rate.
And I think the town center also.
But can I follow up on that for a moment? The town manager and I had a meeting today with a developer that Keith has been working with for a couple of months.
For national building. Yeah.
Who wants, yes, and what he wants to build is market rate apartments. And when I first heard that, I thought, okay, fine, it's the PD zone, I'm sure it's allowed. Well, actually, our zoning regulations do not make it easy, or I would say the regulations don't even allow your conventional market rate apartment. So that developer and I were working on coming up with some regulations that he will then propose to TPZ to build the typical apartment building that we kind of take for granted, but actually Newington's regs don't really allow, which was kind of a surprise to me. I hadn't actually done the analysis to result in that finding that we really don't allow conventional market rate apartment buildings. We allow elderly apartment buildings, we allow affordable apartment buildings, but not market rate apartment buildings.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Craig. So there's two conversations here. So the concept of encouraging the creation of more, for example, housing authority or lower income elderly housing is okay. And then also market rate, transitional. I mean, we're not going to limit it to empty nesters and others, but we would want it to be designed to accommodate their interests, correct? Okay.
We also need to find a way to promote because I think you're right. You hit it right on the nail on the head with the density. We have to somehow turn density to not a bad word.
Yeah.
That seems to be a very bad word in this town. Once you start talking higher densities.
But I think we need to explain when people hear, we need to explain what market rate housing is. I think the conversation, I don't know if there's another term that could be used just to make it more, but I think people get nervous because they're not sure what market rate housing is and what that means and what they're going to look like.
Yep.
And what income fits into market rate housing.
So I think my goal as part of our work together is to, as we define these things, I think I've already looked at the project you talked about in Berlin, and I started to create a visual gallery of housing developments from around the state at different densities. And so when you start to look at these, you suddenly realize density is just a number. It's like a score in a football game. And the issue is, doesn't tell you much. It's really, and I think this is what Newington cares about as well, is the design, the location, the configuration of those. And I think that's really what's important for us moving ahead, is not to just, we're not doing density for the sake of density. We're doing it to strengthen our community.
And I think,
Go ahead, Carol.
oh, no, because I believe the ones in Berlin too have like a 1-car garage. I mean, they're a little bit more upscaler than just, a 4-story high rise with an elevator and maybe in larger square footage. But I think, you're not going to move into a 700 square foot apartment. You're going to move into more like maybe 1,000 or 1,100 square foot apartment where it can accommodate an office with a 1 bedroom and that type of thing. I'm sorry.
Just not too, but I think we do have, the POCD talked about some opportunity sites. So for example, the train station's one, but town center's another.
Right.
That empty nester and other households in the town center can support restaurants and other activities that would strengthen our town center. So there's a double boost.
With the closing of Keeney and the closing of the Food Mart Plaza, the local market again, that's ripe for redevelopment. Also, I know 3333, now it hasn't gone anywhere, Berlin Turnpike, but if you go to their website, the developer that owns that, and it's a pretty prestigious piece of property with office space and retail in the front with all housing in the back. Now, if you told me just 5 years ago that someone would want to live on the Berlin Turnpike, I'd say there's no way, you're nuts. And you know what? If they build them, they'll fill them as fast as they build them.
And I think that there can be spillover benefits for Newington as well.
I think that's a good location too.
And in Carol actually brought up a good point, like garages, they want garages. I mean, people will pay an extra $300 or $400 a month to rent a garage on top of a $2,500 or $3,000 month rent. Yeah. They just, it's different. They're not buying a home for 30 years. They're, okay, I've committed to live here for 5 years and I'm gonna rent.
Yep.
No, absolutely. Like I said, I've known a number of people who have left Newington to go to another town. And it's sad because they really like our town, but they can't find the housing that fits their needs at that age.
So the next one is number 2 on the list, which is family housing units. The Housing Authority doesn't have any family units. They do vouchers. There's a long waiting list for the vouchers, quite competitive. We do have some other projects which are not elderly limited. They are family available. But again, there's
Newington Housing, Glenn, excuse me, Newington Housing Authority, is it just senior and disabled? That's it? That's all they rent to?
that's all they have physical units for.
Okay.
They have family vouchers, we used to call them Section 8 back in the
Yeah.
day, but the bottom line is this is, again, rental assistance that allows people to go and find a unit, and then they will pay the difference between their income and what the unit costs. So that's the rental assistance that they have there. They have 30 vouchers.
Glenn, clear, there's no one living in Newington's Housing Authority that aren't either senior or disabled.
That's correct. That's my feedback from the Housing Authority.
So the vouchers go beyond that.
Yeah, do they use the 30 vouchers? Are they used?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
They
yeah.
are, okay.
Oh, yeah. They've got, I think the last time they opened them up, they had 3,500 applications.
Really? I wasn't aware of the vouchers. I knew they had the units, the 3 different locations, but I didn't know anything about the vouchers. If I
So
did, I
does-
didn't maintain it.
Vouchers follow the person, or do these vouchers stay in Newington? How do these vouchers work?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Let me find out.
I'm pretty sure if the person moves out of town, they keep the voucher in whatever town they've moved to.
I know there is some for apartments too. It's either the voucher follows the person or the voucher follows the
But that
location.
might also explain, this gets back to Steve's point earlier, which is that if I was in a situation such as that, I might just go ahead and apply for voucher anywhere I could at any time, hoping that I would get to the top of the list someplace. So in other words,
And, yeah,
3,500.
the voucher definitely, it follows the person. So
The
if
person.
you can attain one, yeah, it's the person, it's not the property.
But if
Because I know there is
That's why we
apartments that
can't-
have,
Yeah, that's why we can't get us counted these, natural occurring ones, because while they might be today, there's no guarantee that they are tomorrow. It could change.
Yep.
If
Because
you're renting a home to somebody who is getting assistance through Section 8 or whatever they're calling it these days, but they move out, the next tenant might not have it, so that piece of property no longer has that restriction.
so can you look at Newington Apartments? Because I believe they have a certain number of vouchers there. Is that different, what we're talking about?
Well, let me talk to the Housing Authority, because they're going to be
Okay.
the most familiar with the voucher program. And the question is, they issue vouchers and they probably have some knowledge about where those vouchers end up. The question is, somebody could have gotten a voucher elsewhere, but have chosen to use it in Newington. So are they familiar with both sides of this equation? In other words, how many voucher recipients? It is possible, and I just don't know the answer to this, that the voucher recipients in Newington could be the 116 households that were listed as being tenant rental assistance.
And I think they are. I think that's what that is, Glenn.
Okay,
Yep. So we give out 30, but we receive 116.
okay, thank you. That
So-
answers.
But are you interested in me exploring with the Housing Authority or Department of Housing, whether or not we can get more vouchers? If we can get more vouchers, I don't know that we can limit them to Newington. But the issue is that gets us housing unit equivalent points and gets us units on the Affordable Housing Appeals list and meets a housing need for lower income people. Is 30 a magic number?
Would it help Newington residents get housing? So if Newington
Probably-
got the vouchers, would it only be Newington residents that could apply even though they go somewhere else?
Yeah,
I
not
don't believe so.
exclusively, I'm sure.
I think we're here to help, well, we want to help our residents first.
But I think, Carol, if Newington Housing Authority applied for, let's say, 20 more and got them, chances are it would probably go to Newington because Newington people are going to go there to apply. right? But it's not guaranteed.
Right, okay.
So let me talk to the Housing Authority and figure out the details on that. Strategy number 3 here on the list is this concept about aging in place. So ARP reports based on their surveys that 80% of households want to do it. The survey that was done in Newington back in 2014 or 15, I believe, found 60% of people, Newington residents, want to age in place.
Yep.
So to the extent that we can help them do that, we're avoiding a future obligation for people who may end up in senior housing. So if we can have services that help them, it could be advantageous. I don't know that there's any specific recommendation here except to continue to support the senior center, dial-a-ride, Meals on Wheels, in-home healthcare assistance. And if there are ways to look at enhancing elderly tax relief or do other things to allow people and encourage people to stay in their current home, it is a form of economic development for Newington, because if that house gets occupied by a family with school-age children, now we end up that it's a different fiscal equation. So if you were to look at it longevity-wise, that could be an advantageous strategy for us.
Yeah,
I agree.
we also need to be careful there though too, because we don't want to have too old of a population either. That works against us. So, you know, we need that balance.
And I think if you look at the age demographics for Newington, as I have as part of the POCD, I think you can see that there are booms in Newington's growth cycle over time, that people now have lived here for quite a long time, but they're not going to live forever. So there are going to be transitions in the future. So I think understanding people's needs and transitional needs over time is important for us as well.
Yeah, and actually you showed us in the POCD where actually 15 years from now, we actually trend in the right direction. The average age goes down by 2 or 3 years, that's a great thing.
It is, and who knows what's going to happen with COVID and other stuff like that. It's just an unknown. So I think number 4 is, so I put an okay next to number 3, that this is a strategy that makes sense for the town in the long run. I did some work in Wethersfield with them as part of their POCD. What we discovered is that the lot sizes in town are very similar to Newington, that one of the challenges that people had was that their housing units were built in a different time where there wasn't really sort of the closet space that people today expect, that there weren't all these other things. But the number one thing that was missing for people, I think as Carol pointed out earlier, was the first floor master bedroom. That as people get older, just the certainty to know. So one of the things that was recommended in their POCD was the concept of allowing some additional flexibility in side yard setbacks. Now, you can't do this based on age, but you could allow for a one-story addition to a home to intrude into a side yard setback. Maybe you give people a foot or a couple of feet. I'm not familiar with all of the neighborhoods in Newington and whether or not that is a total huge change. But if we could allow people to put on a first floor master bedroom addition in a location, they might otherwise have to apply for a variance or something else, give them a little flexibility. What are your thoughts on this? It's a little different than other strategies, but if that's what people want, maybe that's something that the town could enable. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a great idea, because I'll bet a lot of seniors who wish they could add on a master bedroom on their first floor are so discouraged by the fact that they would need a variance that they don't even apply, because that's a scary thought, having to go through the ZBA process if you're an elderly person.
Steve, you're on ZBA, I mean TPZ.
Well, yeah, but I actually started my political career on ZBA and a long time ago. And I remember that we had an attorney come in and spoke to us, and he was actually really good. He goes, I'm going to tell you right now, he goes, I'm going to say without any doubt, 99.5% of the petitions that come in here, you should reject because you don't have the right to pass them. Now, having said that, I'm also going to tell you, pass 99.5% of them because they make sense and no one's ever going to fight it. So don't stand on principle that you have to have this 5-foot setback when it doesn't make any sense, because every other house in the neighborhood has got a 3-foot setback. And now you're holding this poor gentleman or couple right? From not moving forward with the same addition that everybody else has because the zoning has changed.
Right.
So I think it's a great idea, right? And I think planning and zoning is open to these kind of things now. I really do.
And I support that. So that's something that to be on TPZ's radar down the road when we can have.
What I'll do is I'll work with Craig. We'll take a look at the residential zoning districts and put together what we think might be some numbers. Every foot makes a difference. It just could facilitate something that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So I'll work with Craig and we'll see what we can accomplish on this one.
And Craig, we just need to be very careful how it goes back to TP&Z as a request, not as a demand.
Yes, absolutely.
We get very sensitive.
I understand. I view this as a little bit of a menu that we're going to develop a menu of options, and then we're going to get feedback on it and decide which ones we want to pursue in the future or which ones may disappear off our list.
Okay.
So the next page, the top of the next page, number 5, is the concept of accessory dwelling units. Now, this can be important for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you're an elderly person living by yourself, struggling with housing costs, you could let somebody live in your house and you get income and you're able to stay there longer. That person could be a caregiver. It could be somebody who's going to mow your grass and shovel your driveway and do all of this. So there's a lot of reasons why that could help somebody age in place. And for somebody who is getting older but wants to go through, as Carol described it, as transitional housing, this could be a situation where, in fact, they could make a transition to a home. Now, the concern that most communities have on this particular issue is that that's a second housing unit, and so it makes a one family a two family. And so what a number of towns have done on this particular issue is they don't require a special permit for this, but they do require an operable door on a common wall. Most people do not want to share their housing unit with another person, but they'll do it if they have to. And so one of the things that communities have done on this is to say, look, if it's going to be a detached dwelling unit of any type, that's a special permit. But if it's going to be within or attached to the home, you can do that, provided you meet the following standards. And there would be standards added to the current regulations in Newington.
Actually, I think, Craig, you brought this up to TPZ already, didn't you?
I think it's mentioned in the POCD.
We do allow accessory apartments by special permit, and I have two concerns with that. Number one, it's by special permit, which scares people off. It's an additional expense. It takes months. Public hearing, the whole world knows your business, so that has a kind of a chilling effect, I think. But also, the regulations themselves are really complicated with a whole bunch of moving parts. I've had to come up with a chart of 3 intersecting circles to explain to people how these regulations work. Just for an accessory apartment, it's really, they really need to be not liberalized per se, just made clearer and simpler.
There are some communities too that require, the statutes actually allow for accessory dwelling units under certain circumstances to count to your state affordable housing appeals list. But the requirements are a little bit like what Craig described, which is that, it's almost like 3 intersecting circles in terms of what you actually have to do to make that happen. So I think accessory dwelling units are an opportunity to help people provide housing, and they could help provide for state counted affordable housing units. Is this one that you'd like to consider as a possibility moving forward to float by planning and zoning, or what do you think, Carol?
I have a question. So how would this differ from in-law apartments?
Essentially it is, except the in-law part is taken out.
Okay, so
It doesn't have to be a family member.
Then what would happen when the person then goes to sell their residence?
The apartment would have to be rented to a moderate income person, which means somebody would need to track that, probably the town planner, the way I do with Hopkins Village.
Well, I think most people don't want to share their housing unit with another person. When you require an operable door on a common wall, that means that this person has access to your house and you have access to theirs.
Right, so if you go to sell your property, like for an in-law, if someone sells a home with an in-law that was approved by TPZ, what happens? Does that become part of their one family residence?
Well, When you say,
Special permit filed on the land records, so the special permit runs in perpetuity.
Right.
So that ability to have a accessory apartment or in-law apartment, whatever you want to call it, is always there. It's on the land record.
Right. But I don't know, maybe I'm thinking, but isn't it, don't they, well,
well, right now, there are no restrictions on who can rent the apartment. We call it an in-law apartment. And because there is the common door that doesn't lock, because there's one electric bill, one phone bill, it tends to only be a family member. We don't mandate that. We just sort of let that happen naturally, that it'd be a family member. But if we wanted to be able to take credit for some of these accessory apartments by making the approval conditional on the unit being rented to a low to moderate income person, either family or non-family, either one, that could pick us up a few more, another dozen or so state affordable units that meet the state's definition of affordable, because the approval would be with the stipulation that the tenant has to be lower moderate income.
So then, does it need to be deed restricted, Glenn, or Craig?
Now, well, it wouldn't be deed restriction technically, but it would be in the special permit. So it would be.
Let me go back and review the details of the statute. So what I think makes sense here right now is, are you comfortable with the possible concept of an accessory apartment by zoning permit only?
I am.
Yes, TPZ members. Oh, no, the one just did. How about you former TPZ members? Do you think?
Yes.
you have two former, that's right.
Let
And
me
again,
do
I
this.
think there is some support for this, you know.
Let me flesh this out. Let me lay out how we can clean up our current regs and also what the regulation would look like if it was going to count to 830G. And then it becomes an a la carte menu that people can look at and decide how they'd like to proceed.
Would the existing, what we know existing wise be counted going forward?
If it meets the state reporting criteria. And again, Carol, it's complicated enough. I don't recall the details off the top of my head. So what I'm going to do is go look at it. It's right in 830G. And so I'll summarize for you what that looks like. Strategy number 6 here is the concept of greater building height, coverage, or density for affordable housing. Now this gets a little bit, Craig, what's the big impediment over at National Welding? Is it height? Is it density? Is it?
No, the problem is in the PD zone, we don't allow conventional apartments.
So it's just a use issue?
Correct.
Okay. So, I mean, I look at Market Square Apartments and I said to myself, is that the tallest building in Newington?
Probably.
Yeah, other than maybe the hospital.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Steve.
Or the new active adult that was approved on Cedar but has not been built yet.
What was
So
that?
that's
Craig?
3 stories, right?
Oh no, either 4 or 5. Remember, they had
That's right.
to amend the regs to allow a greater height, which was
Right.
approved.
I mean, I don't have a problem with height. It just depends on the location. Because if you have if you're visualizing like Market Square and you're going to go 6 stories, Market Square is so narrow, you're
Yep.
going to look like you're in a city. But if you're like in West Hartford on South Main Street where the road is, you have 4 lanes,
Yep.
they don't look as high. I think it's more perception and look wise. But I mean, you don't want to be feel like you're crowded in driving down a street, that you're enclosed.
Glenn, I think it's something we have to look at because of the density issue in town, meaning we don't have the land. You almost have to go up. Now, maybe we don't go 7 or 8 stories, but 4 or 5 stories.
Yeah. And I think design, is important on this. So I think the issue is if we were to do a visual preference survey for people, if we asked them simply the question, are you comfortable with a 4-story building? The response across the board might be no. But if we said, which of these buildings do you like? You can imagine some very attractive and elegant 4 stories and some pretty butt ugly 2-story or 3 stories. So
Yeah, well, I mean, if you took National Welding as a perfect example, you were almost 4 stories before you're up to road level. right?
Correct.
So, so a 7-story building is going to look like it's 3 stories.
Yep.
Right, that's what I say, it's location.
Yep, okay. Number 7 is the concept, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, is the concept of a redevelopment option in, could be a business zone. So whether it's the Berlin Turnpike or other locations that, these are areas, again, where the zoning districts today may not allow housing as a use. Is that something that we're comfortable with considering, or?
We have a reg for senior housing in any zone, I believe. Is that right, Craig?
I think
It was back in 2006, I think it was done.
yes, active, yes, adult elderly housing is allowed in any zone by special permit.
So Craig, on apartments in a PD zone, would you have to get a zone change? Would you have to get a special permit? How would you go about doing that?
Yes, exactly, the zone change. That's what I'm working
Zone
with
change?
the operator on. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I looked at West Hartford. They have some zoning regulations that I think would work in Newington.
Okay.
There they have the mixed use, retail, commercial, and then
Yes, I like that.
Do you think TPZ would how do you think the TPZ or the community would react to a zone change to a PD zone for housing? Is that an area that's going to make people uncomfortable initially, or do you think it's something, again, that we could explain to people, this is going to meet the housing needs of the community? What do you think the reaction is going to be?
I think from what I know of the PD zone, it's kind of scattered amongst, all around the town. So it could work beautifully, I think, in some areas, and in some areas, no. So maybe it'd have to be by special exception or special permit.
So my question now, Steve, is whether or not how specific do you want us to be getting as part of this work? So for example, Craig and I could go around town and look at all the PD zones and say, yeah, this one could probably work. That one probably could not work. We can actually suggest and maybe create a PD1 and a PD2 or a PD and a PDR or some other type of district to suggest specific zoning changes, or is that getting too specific and we'd rather be flexible?
I think the more specific you are, the better it is when you bring it to planning and zoning, because then they really can understand what you're talking about.
Yep.
I agree.
And visualize it.
Yeah, I agree. And I really think we have to educate the residents what it means. I
Yep.
think that's a huge thing is, in market, we have to market it right.
Yep. And I think one of the things that I did some work in a town in Connecticut where they were considering the very issues that we're talking about, and working with the community. They identified probable sites that the community would support. And then they put together different development scenarios and said, okay, if it's going to be this site, do you think this development program A, B, C, or D, which one do you think fits there best? And the people really liked having the choice and the option, and they actually stretched the envelope a little bit. So I think we can get to a visual preference survey again and say, okay, this area is more in like this, and this area is more like that. So I'll work with Craig on this one as well.
And I think also, Glenn, it sends a clear message to the future developer. Look, if I put some time and effort in this, it's probably going to fly, versus, hey, I got to put $200,000 into this, and I have no idea if they're even going to entertain it. So when that's what we want to do here. We want to start getting that message out that, we're looking for you to come here. And if you bring the right plan, it's going to fly.
Yep. In all my years, one of my favorite sayings is, I've never met an applicant who doesn't want an approval.
Right.
If we can explain
We
to
would do
them,
a lot of the work for them
well, to explain to them what our goals are and fit it in
and
with
what we
their
want.
Yep.
Yeah.
Strategy number 8, a permanent exemption from 830G. So as part of the 2020 census, our base number of housing units is going to increase from the 13,011 that we had in 2010. So our percentage is going to increase a little bit, but we need about 147 units or 150 units, we'll say, to get a permanent exemption from 830G. Seems to me that that's close enough. I think that with some elderly housing, with some tenant rental assistance, with some other stuff, we can get there. I think, should this be a goal of the town?
Yes.
I believe so. I think we need to direct the narrative and not the developer.
Right. We also, you have 108. Is Dakota still coming, Craig? Someone told me they got their financing. You're off. You're muted, Craig.
I was pressing the space bar, which is supposed to unmute me, but it wasn't working. Yes, their attorney called me a month or so ago and said they want to come back to P&Z for some changes regarding making some of the two-bedroom units into threes. But yes, they definitely plan on going forward.
So that'd be 108 units. And
Yes.
then you've got 30 in Victory Gardens,
If they come, yeah.
if they
We're
come.
there. We're so close.
Are all the units at Dakota affordable?
There are some market rate, but we're not even talking about them. Yeah, the 108 that we talked about are the affordable ones.
Right.
There's 108 affordable units.
Yeah.
That's awesome, because now, and then with the 30 at Victory Gardens, you guys are on the cusp of a 10%. Yeah, that's awesome.
And if you
Congratulations.
can look to see if there's any of those vouchers that are out there or the, the other, yeah,
Mortgages, right.
right.
Yeah. Perfect.
It'd be rather close.
So,
All right, that
Craig,
gets us to the top of page 22, which is just what we're talking about, which is that if we can attract more tenant rental assistance or more CHFA mortgages to Newington, we get the benefit. So we're close enough to the threshold. A couple of those units gets us over the 10% and bingo. So, I mean, I don't know what we can do. I think Newington is a naturally attractive community for these types of programs. But if there are ways for us to be able to attract more, that could be helpful. Is this something we want to continue with in the program?
Yes,
I say yes.
yes.
Strategy number 10 was a 4-year moratorium from 830G. So I understand the application to the state's on hold with that, Craig? You got to unmute. Yeah.
Correct.
So this tells us how we get to set aside points. Do you remember what your point total was, Craig?
No, I don't remember, but we had more than enough points. We had far more points than we needed.
So I guess, is there a reason why the town hasn't applied for the moratorium?
Yes, because there was a conflict of opinions on the council as to whether Newington should do this or not. It was a kind of a moral discussion. It was very interesting to hear the debate. So they tabled it pending the outcome of this process that we're doing right now.
Yep. So then getting back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, we're very close to meeting the state guidelines. And the big advantage is that Newington gets to make the decisions for itself, where the units go, how they're designed, how we're going to promote, encourage them, and to make sure that they fit what the community needs and what the community wants. Without a moratorium, the dialogue shifts, and it's an applicant who basically says to the commission, this is what I'm proposing here, and if you turn me down, I can move in a different direction. So there can be some advantages to both. I think Newington has done a great job. We've got thousands of naturally occurring affordable housing units, but we're still subject to the Affordable Housing Appeals procedure.
I agree with you, Glenn, but one thing is you'd have a moratorium for 4 years and everything may just stop and we may not move forward. It's very possible this could happen. That's why we're here today, because I didn't want to see a moratorium because we were that close.
But I think the moratorium.
And I'm listening to what you have to say today, and it's a different spin on it.
Well, I'm just thinking, Mike, that if we were to get the moratorium in the 4 years that the moratorium's in place, we can actually get to the 10%.
Mhm.
So if we don't have the moratorium in place, right up until we get to the COs for all of the units, somebody could still come in on day before the COs get issued and have an 830J.
Right.
So
250 units.
Right, but we still
Right.
want to keep working towards, more development and redevelopment.
yeah, and I think
And we have to make sure that is in place, because what may happen is you'll get the moratorium. Oh, well, we're all set. We don't have to let anybody in here because we have a moratorium, and then we don't go
that's a good
forward.
point.
And then you got another 4 years. Well, we already had a moratorium, but we didn't succeed. We didn't get anything accomplished because it got put on the back burner because we're working on other things now.
Yeah, Glenn, I worked pretty hard to not have that moratorium move forward. I just think it sends the wrong message. I understand where you're coming from, but I just think it sends, and this message gets resonated out in the greater Hartford community and even further, that we're not open, that we're not going to entertain it.
Right.
And again, I think it's up to us to get this housing up to the 10%, then we can pick and choose. And I think we are relatively close. And if these couple developments come through, then it's a non-issue. But let's get there. And then we can say, hey, look, we've done our part. Now we're going to entertain additional complexes, but to our choosing. You know, we're not at that point yet.
Yep, I'm with you. So I'm gonna think about a way to word this, because I think the issue is, I think you spoke eloquently, Steve, in terms of, let's get the rules and programs and procedure for the development we want. And if it gets us exempt or it doesn't get us exempt, it's still the community we want Newington to be. The Newington wants to be itself. So a moratorium may not be the ultimate. For many communities, they aspire to this. It's their number one goal. And I think
Again, I firmly believe for the vast majority of the Newington citizens, some sort of subsidy is greatly appreciated for housing. Not maybe necessarily have to have, you know, but especially starting out or ending. We are not, you know, we're never going to be Simsbury. We're never going to be West Hartford. And I don't think we need to be. We are a very blue collar town. There's nothing wrong with that. Someone, you know, has to fix your car. Someone has to come and do your plumbing. So, and again, and I'm not trying to demean any of these jobs, because some of these positions actually now are all in six figures, but you got to start out much lower. Even a teacher, or a cop, they're still $50,000 a year. That's not a lot of money, and it's not going to buy you very much in the town of Newington. So we need to make sure that we continue to have affordable housing. Yep. And again, I think we do have a tremendous amount. If we could find some way of getting our natural occurring affordable housing counted, this discussion wouldn't be moving forward. We're there. We so far exceed the limits, but it doesn't count. So there's no sense in really talking about it, right? It's just.
Let me figure out how to word that.
I'm going to take the conversation into a different way, because I was one that was in favor of going for the moratorium. That if, say, we apply, get approved, and in 6 months we have figured out how we are going to do this, we can then, for lack of better words, release the moratorium and say, okay, we're done. We don't want to, or are we fixed at 4 years?
Well, you get 4 years, but during that time frame, you can receive applications and address them and deal with them. The developer loses the ability to leverage the town and say, well, you better have a substantial threat to public health or safety, as opposed to the town saying, listen, we're enabling your development, we're approving it. The burden of proof would rest with you if we get to sort of a disagreement. So you could still encourage the development, but not have it necessarily forced upon you. So
But it's not forced for 4 years. So in 6 months, we say we apply, get approved, and 6 months down the road, we've come to where we want. You know, we've come to the areas and everything we're going to dictate. We can then apply to the state and say, we don't want a moratorium anymore. Yes or no?
Well, to my knowledge, that question has never come up.
Yeah, I don't think the answer is yes to that. I think you could go ahead and allow a project in, but I think the moratorium stays in place. You could choose to take an application and hear it. But again, I mean, I go back to Dakota Partners, and I was not particularly thrilled with what they were proposing, but yet they had the right, and we still turned it down, and it ended up going to court. And I knew we were going to lose, and we lost. And here it comes.
Right, but I mean, we could have asked for a better project, but I just thought that, this is only 8-33 housing. So if somebody comes to us with an affordable housing with market rate and whatever, we could still approve it, and that would count towards our 10%.
Correct.
This is only a moratorium on 8-30G housing.
I mean, you could get affordable housing applications. What it does, though, 830G shifts the burden of proof to the applicant. A moratorium or hitting the 10% shifts the burden of proof that now the town enjoys that and the burden of proof falls to the other party. So
Right.
it's just a question of that. But you've raised some interesting questions. Let me wrap my head around both of those, and then I'll come back to you with some ideas.
Okay.
Got a question for
Also
Craig.
numbers.
Craig?
Craig,
Yep.
you're muted again. Okay. We talked about Dakota. We talked about Victory Gardens and maybe a couple other projects. You have a time frame when they may break ground for these? Have you heard anything?
Well, I know Dakota was, last I heard, still working to get their financing. And so all of their engineering was on hold until they secured their financing. So I don't know what their timetable is. They did not get the CHFA tax credits that they had hoped for the last round. The current round, I think, is this fall. So they may know by this fall if they're when they'll be proceeding. But it's all a matter of getting their financing.
I would think, Mike, the earliest it would be is next spring. I don't see it any sooner than that. And it could be next summer to next fall. Because they did get turned down. They didn't get their points. They didn't get the credits that they needed to move forward. And that, my guess, is why they didn't get their financing. And if I remember correctly too, I'm pretty sure Dakota right now has too many projects open and they haven't closed out some of them. So the Fed doesn't want to give them any more money
Yeah.
until they close some of them out.
That's what I heard.
So it brings us now to the top of page 23, number 12. The statutes allow for what's called inclusionary zoning, and inclusionary zoning is a standard which, again, Newington is so close to the 10% list. The inclusionary zoning standard in some communities says any housing development that is proposed in our community has to provide at least 10% affordable housing within the development. So a set-aside development is 30% of the units for 40 years. And the state threshold is 10%. Newington's almost at 10%. So some towns say if a housing development comes in and none of it's affordable, it puts us further away from our goal. But I think if I understand our conversation earlier, the town is looking to make progress on housing related issues and developments, but not necessarily require it across the board of everybody. Is that true?
Oh.
Okay.
Can I just chime in for a minute?
Yes.
I also know people who have left Newington because they can't find the type of housing that they want at the higher end.
Right.
Because if you look and you look at what your, our house is over $1 million or whatever. I mean, so they can't, and unfortunately we don't have the land available to do, 3/4 acre and acre lots with housing that has 3,000 square feet. We don't have that, but on that spectrum too, people are moving out because they are going to other towns that they can purchase homes that are there. I mean, that's something that unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to be able to do here.
I'm with you.
But let me ask you a question. So I think we have one piece of property that I know of that it's the remains of a farm. They're looking to do a subdivision there. So if we did this inclusionary zoning, would that development then be required to do the 10%?
No, because that application has already been filed. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think to add on to what Craig said, if the regulation was in place today, yes. If they've already applied, but the regulations is not in place, it would take us, even if we were the whole commission, it would take us 30 to 60 days to get that regs on the books. So
Okay. Then Craig, let me ask you this question, and just your opinion, because there's no way of knowing for sure. But a project like that, would that kill that project?
requiring them to sell 1 or 2 lots to an affordable family? No, not at all. They've
Okay.
they've shoehorned every possible lot into that subdivision. Yeah.
Well, that's their goal, because let's face it, planning and zoning typically doesn't add lots, they only subtract lots.
They may be expecting TPZ to say, to deny one or two lots or mandate that they be affordable. I don't, obviously I don't know their game plan,
Yeah,
but I know the subdivision off of Maple Hill, Donna DeMoro's subdivision,
Yes.
I forget.
yeah.
It was approved before my time. I think Carol, you were on. Exactly. The original plans were for like 14 units, but P&Z told them, no, we think that's too many, and only gave them 12. I'm not sure how that how you were able to do that, but you did. So maybe that's P&Z might want to consider that with well, we can at this point with Packard with Peckham, but somehow Packard's Way you were able to do it.
Yeah, I personally like the inclusionary zoning. I think that's a great way to continually strive to keep your goal. You know, and you're going to get a mix. You're going to get market rate, and you're going to get some affordable housing at the same time. And I think it makes it attractive to a developer. And this is just my personal opinion, but I think it might be the way to go. I'm sure there's going to be people that don't agree with me, but.
Well, some communities have a blend of 12 and 13. So 13 is about an affordable housing fee. So what they say is if everybody who's going to develop in Newington has an obligation to provide for affordable housing, they can either do it in their project or they can do it through payment of a fee into what becomes a housing trust fund at the town level. So the issue is, as Carol pointed out, a very high-end developer said, listen, it doesn't kind of support my marketing influence or area if affordable housing unit goes in here. So I'm going to put money into the fund. And other people may say, you know what, I'd like a density bonus for doing affordable housing, or they're going to put 10% of the units in their development, et cetera. So there can be a palette of options here under the umbrella of inclusionary zoning. The whole idea is
you could do a hybrid of that, right? You could either or. You didn't have to do. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Or both. I mean,
Okay.
I know one
All
town.
right, well, that's interesting. I know Florida does that with wetlands. You can fill in, because all Florida is wetlands, right? So you can go ahead and fill in anything that you want, build on it. You just got to buy some worthless property someplace else and deem that wetlands for perpetuity.
All right, let me see if I can put something together in this area. I do know some towns downstate that have established that any zoning permit, for example, today we have when somebody comes in for a zoning permit, they make a payment to the town to cover the permit fee. They also make a payment to the state to cover the DEP fee. And they've tacked on an affordable housing fee that goes along with that. It's a percentage of the building permit fee. Money goes into a housing trust fund that supports, for example, conceptual site planning for expansion for the housing authority. There's money in a fund that can go to facilitate the creation of affordable housing in other locations. Carol?
And that's under control of the town,
Yes,
the housing fund?
yes. It's a special fund authorized by the statute, and money can go into it from donations, from grants, from all sorts of different ways. And that money, I know one town in Fairfield County that essentially redeveloped a housing authority site. They'd been built in the 60s. The units were in poor condition. They were kind of obsolete in terms of the way they were built, two-story with outside access for each unit and no common area. So an elderly person who had to go to their car had to walk out onto a snow-covered balcony, and it just didn't work. They used the money to redesign the project so it became all the units were internal with a community room, and parking was available within the complex. So they didn't have to find any other money to do that. They had the money in this account.
And that money then it is controlled by the council or its designee. You know, if there was a committee that
Or
they.
yeah, I mean, it becomes a municipal account.
Okay.
And the expenditure of those funds would be perhaps under the control of the council, but the purpose of the fund would be for housing related expenses. So it might involve a recommendation from, example, housing committee in town or something else like that to expend the funds for this.
Okay.
And what's the average percentage like that community did? Do you know what they put in?
It wasn't a big amount. It was just, every zoning permit had a little bit, but they ended up with over $100,000. So it was available to them over the course of some period of time. So Craig, any idea how much you collect each year in building permits? Maybe you don't know though, because that's, yeah. All right, let me see what I can find out on that. Number 14 is, again, we've got the interfaith housing that created housing developments. The town can work with local nonprofits to search for additional opportunities for affordable housing. The biggest problem or issue that we can have sometimes is land, but sometimes the town can get land from the state and pass it through for affordable housing developments and other things. Is this something that you think is replicable in the future? Can we repeat interfaith and something like that? Not necessarily with interfaith, but with other nonprofit groups in town?
I would say the answer to that is yes. And interfaith has been extremely successful.
So we would want to continue those efforts.
I mean, it's 50 years now, I believe, or pretty
Wow.
close to it,
Yeah.
So
Okay. 15 is a little bit of a challenge for us. Again, Newington is predominantly developed. There aren't land parcels. Some communities have more available land than Newington does. So Craig and I have not really started to go through surplus or town-owned or state-owned land or facilities that might be available for us. I think there may be a couple, but how would you feel about asking that, surplus town parcels or facilities or state parcels or facilities be reserved for housing developments in the future?
that's an interesting question for me. I'd have to think about that before I could give you an answer.
Yep.
Off the top of my head, I could think of some prime spots, but I would like to see it developed. I'm not so sure necessarily other people would like to see it developed.
No, Craig, I'm the facility on Mountain Road, the state,
That's what I was thinking of.
what's that called? Cedar?
The regional center?
Oh, you're talking about the old hospital on
Children's
Russell Road?
Oh, Russell Road. Yeah.
Russell
I'm-
Road.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, the town manager is either thinking about or is actually talking to developers, residential developers, about something up there, which I know is very controversial in Newington because Newington beat back the Toll Brothers just as I got here 8 years ago. But I know the manager is looking at the possibility of putting high-end housing and maybe affordable housing too as a percentage of it at the Cedar Crest site.
Problem is the abatement up there. There's a lot of pollution right now.
So it's one of the difficult with COVID around or whatever, we find ourselves in a situation where school enrollments are below what they've been historically. Well, we also so you might come to the conclusion there could be surplus school buildings. But then we also look at a situation where COVID's here and our kids are going to go back to school, but they're going to need double the space because social distancing. I mean, we may not actually have surplus facilities the way that we thought. But in a community where land is a challenging asset to locate and dedicate, it's the number one need. It's pretty hard to address affordable housing without that from the town's perspective. So if we focus in on private development, then it's encouraging, promoting rezoning and other things that can work in that direction. But for the housing authority, their ability, I think they feel that they're built out on their current sites. There's really no additional space, and that, for partnering with a nonprofit or working with the housing authority would need new land or a new site. So
Again, I think Newington Center is prime for this. So, I mean, if you wanted to pick a spot, I think when we redevelop Newington Center, especially again with Keeney and Best Plaza,
Yep.
or local market, yeah, it would definitely make sense to have housing as a piece of that.
Well, the manager and I are talking to a developer who's looking to buy Keeney and possibly the Best Market across the street. And he's talking about residential, mixed use, actually, some commercial and residential. we don't have the fish securely on the hook, so I haven't said anything about some amount of affordable housing in the mix, but that's a possibility.
I think as part of the development of that scale, Craig, if the timing allows for exploration of that concept, in other words, if all the housing is one flavor, then the town center might not be as vibrant or active or successful a place as if there was some options. Younger people, older people, et cetera. So let
I
me
think the other key piece too in the town center, and we don't talk about it much because they haven't wanted to do anything, but it's the Harvard Hospital site. If they tore down some of the older buildings and redeveloped or just develop some of the empty lots that they have there, I mean, that could, and I'm assuming it would all go medical. That would be a big plus to the town. And
Yeah.
Absolutely.
definitely feed the center. So jobs, with jobs come housing, housing comes restaurants, restaurants come shops, and it just snowballs. It keeps going.
Yep. Number 16. So again, we're so close. We've got so many units in the hopper. Some towns are looking at ways to purchase existing housing units and deed restrict them. And
Is there funding for it?
pardon me?
Is there funding to purchase these units?
No, but doesn't necessarily have to be a huge expense to do this. So the question is how close you can get to your either moratorium for your moratorium or your 10%. If a house sells for $150,000, you buy it for $150,000, put a deed restriction on it and sell it for $150,000. So you do have to eat some closing costs in the middle of that. But you're also going to deed restrict an existing housing unit rather than building new units. So I
Oh, you're
think,
talking about us buying and then reselling, not us buying and holding on to it.
That's an
yeah,
interesting concept, Glenn. I
Well-
actually like that.
well, I
I
think
don't know if if it would fly, but it sounds pretty decent.
The concept is good.
Greg, what do we get for CDBG funding?
Well, we don't get any because we're not an entitlement city. But in years past, we have gotten some small cities money to do a couple of projects at the Housing Authority, a new roof project a few years ago. And we're applying for some steep money this year, but nothing for housing. I mean, no steep money for housing.
Yeah, so I was just thinking if we could get some seed money that we could roll through. I mean, Farmington has done some interesting work over the years that they actually have some money they've put aside for equity sharing with homeowners so that they help them with the down payment for lower income people.
Yep.
And then when that unit sells for whatever the profit is, the increment, they had a piece of the pie. So they're actually replacing and refunding their or replenishing their fund. And so it's a situation where they're providing for affordable housing in a kind of a creative way.
Isn't that how Hopkins Village kind of works? That's what I
Yes.
thought.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
did not put any money in there. I think what we did, we approved it with a density bonus, and in return for being able to build more units, the developer agreed to make them all affordable.
Right, and they can only sell for a certain amount over
Right,
what they
Right, yeah.
purchased it for.
and they have to sell to a low to mod income family.
Right.
And then those are the 36 deed restricted units we're talking about, right? Hopkins Village, I
Yes.
believe.
But
That's interesting with helping with down payment assistance.
Yeah, it is. That's a good idea.
okay. All right. So I think that rolls us through the options which I suggested here. There are some questions on page 24. I think, was the information helpful? What do you think of the key housing issues, the main needs, and the housing strategies? We've kind of touched on all of those in some way, shape, or form. Is there anything that the committee members would like to add with regard to any of these? Any ideas, strategies, or approaches that you think would work particularly well for Newington?
personally think we've touched on a lot of the issues already. I think this has probably been the best meeting to date, and not to diminish our earlier meetings, but I mean, this one really seemed, we covered a lot of ground. It seems that we're pretty much on the same page. Maybe want to get there a little bit differently. But again, I think we're off to a good start. And I think if we come out of this with a positive message, we can turn it back to the council with a positive message. It turns to the public with a positive message. It's now successful. And if it becomes political at the council level, it's not going to go anywhere. And my goal is to try to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think if everybody's comfortable with that concept, what I think the next step is that our next meeting, we can figure out, be roughly a month from now. But my job, I believe, is to take and flesh out these concepts based on the feedback that you've given me today. And if anything else pops to mind, which I think complements something you've given me in terms of feedback, I may add that in. But I think the next booklet would be called something like Preliminary Strategies Workbook. They're not final decisions yet, but be able to flesh out the language, and you can say, you know what, now that I read it, I think it's an even better idea or an even worse idea. But we can refine that as we go forward. And then at that point in time, I think as we get towards the end of summer, beginning of fall, might be in a position to have a preliminary program we can start to share with other people, whether it's with the community or with other boards, commissions, et cetera, but to try to get that information out. Does that sound like a reasonable next step for people?
Yes. Yep.
Perfect. I think I don't have anything else I wanted to ask you. The feedback's been excellent. Thank you very, very much. I'll work with this and go from here. Craig, anything else? Carol, Steve, Mike?
Oh, I want to thank you. I think I agree with Steve. I think this was very, very productive. I didn't know what this conversation was going to bring tonight. And no, I'm really happy with the way it's moving forward.
Perfect. Well, the ball's in my court, and I'll see you all well, actually, for the members, Steve, I'll see you in a week and a half, the public hearing on the POCD.
Okay.
And the rest of you, I'll keep working. I'll see you soon.
Okay, but
Everybody.
because we still have housekeeping to do. Glenn, you can go. No, Glenn, actually stick around because we need to schedule our next meeting.
Okay, go ahead.
By approval of minutes, can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
Make a motion, approve the minutes.
I'll second that.
Okay, all in favor? Oh, any discussion, any corrections? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, schedule next meeting. Okay, Glenn, I heard you say roughly a month from now?
Yeah, so for meeting, this is the second Monday of the month. So in August, that would be the 10th. Or if you wanted a little bit more time, we could go to the next week, which is the 17th. So if Mondays are generally good for people, the 10th or the 17th, either one of those would be fine with me.
It's 6 o'clock. I love the 6 o'clock timing.
Yeah,
I do too.
Yeah, that's fine.
so 6
I would
o'clock.
prefer the 17th if possible.
That's fine.
Okay,
Sounds like a plan.
okay, August 17th, good. Okay, I guess that's all we have.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You.
Everybody forgot to make a motion to adjourn.
Yes, Bill, could you make a motion to adjourn? Thank you. Seconded by, let's see, who do I hear? I think I hear somebody seconding it. I'm not sure who, though. The minutes we'll say by consensus that the motion to adjourn.
That works. All right, hold on. Let me finish up the meeting on the other side.